So this is the Scrutone podcast, the podcast of the Scrutone Cafe, and our guest today is Stephen Balogh, who is a British national organizer for the New Cultural Forum, and also a candidate for the Szociáldemokrata Party in Great Britain for the upcoming elections, and as his name indicates, he has a Hungarian heritage ancestors here. So, what is your Hungarian heritage,
Well,
at Hungary?
Yes, I can talk about that a little bit. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for the invitation to come onto this podcast. You are one of the very few people who's interviewed me who doesn't have to ask how to pronounce my name. Balogh. I always have to say Balogh, hard G, like Kellogg, because it comes across often like an Irish name or a Scottish name. So we're sitting here in the Scrutone Cafe about 200 metres away from Ferenciek, where from the age of 9, the first time I came to Hungary, and I'll explain the backstory a little bit, we used to come very occasionally to church. My grandmother, who stayed in Hungary, for her, that was quite a sort of more like a cultural anchor in a time of difficulty. So my backstory is this: I was born in London of Hungarian refugee parents. So many of us, of course, who are offspring in such a situation. In a nutshell, my father was born in Szentes. The family ended up in Budapest. My mother in Baja. They stayed in Baja. Both sides of the family fractured in 1956 afterwards. One parent in each case left with some offspring and the other half left behind. So there's a story of fracture and to some extent reconciliation within the Hungarian side of my story. I'll come to the sort of British side in a second, but to pursue the Hungarian side, 1976, I was born in 1967, so as a 9-year-old, we got in the car with my 2 sisters and parents, and we drove across Europe, big adventure, reached Hegyeshalom. I remember very, very vividly the long queues and the machine guns and all of that. And we ended up at the Balaton. I also remember it was raining heavily when we stopped at the Balaton and eventually came up to Budapest. So that was the first time I came to Hungary. And since that time, sort of ebbing and flowing, I have been tapping into my Hungarian blood, tapping into my Hungarian roots. But at the same time, and I'll pause here in a second, I feel very, very much British and very much part of Britain. I feel absolutely rooted in it. So on this day where we talk about nations and nationhood, I work out how to wear 2 hats at the same time without contradiction.
That's how?
Actually, I don't find that difficult. No, I don't find that difficult, and I would like to thank my parents for that. In 1967, when I was born, my mother had been in Britain. She was received wonderfully by a volunteer who offered to sponsor her as a refugee, helped finish her education, and so on. And my father ended up with his father in eastern France. It still works because my grandfather was an engineer. My father ended up at university in Paris. And because when they met eventually, my parents, because my mother's side was slightly firmer in England than my father in France, I'm British and not French, so that's another accident of history. But they made a very strong decision that I and my 2 sisters, younger sisters, would be brought up as British can be. That meant a compromise. It meant a compromise for them. It meant that we weren't brought up bilingual or bicultural. I'm cross about that because I find it very hard to speak Hungarian. I would love to be fluent in Hungarian. But I think that was the right decision in that era. There was an expectation that in return for the welcome into a country, an unreserved welcome into the country, there was the need to recognise that and to assimilate and to contribute. And that, I think, is a really deep thing inside me. But that's not the same thing as letting go of an inherited culture. The two can go side by side as long as the latter doesn't crush the former. And that's one of the big issues in politics in our day in Britain, of course in the Western world generally.
And you spoke about that your parents were actually refugees in Great Britain. So and as far as I know, you held social conservative positions, more or less, in the political life. So inevitably and naturally, the question, I guess it's used to ask about you, that what is your position of immigration if your parents were refugees? What you can say about the recent migration crisis?
Yes. Well, I think that's a very pertinent point, and I think, of course, my parents left in reaction to the Fora d'Alom in 1956, to the uprising, and in the aftermath of that. You would expect them to have, as it were, let's call it very simply, anti-communist feelings. Yeah. Actually, I think it was more mixed than that. I think, certainly for the grandparent in each case, they'd lived through the 1930s, which were not a great period of time either, on the other side of the political spectrum. Yeah. So when I was growing up and reached my political consciousness, it was much more, I sort of inherited quite a bit of a sense of the late 1940s in Hungary, when my father in particular was growing up. He was born in 1940, so in the late 40s. He lived as an older child through the big changes where people were being forced to say and do logically impossible things and so on. So I considered myself insulated against radical socialism from a very early age. I wouldn't say other members of my family necessarily would follow that route, but that was for me. So I've always found myself a social conservative. I've never considered myself a capital C conservative as a member of the Conservative Party. But at bottom, I suppose, and we can explore this a little bit more maybe, I consider that the natural conservative position, which is maximising the agency of individuals, maximising the possibility of their potential, setting in place the environment in which they can flourish, but with an absolute responsibility to have due regard for others, rather than it being an entirely individual-based sense. I think those two positions taken together ideally reach a balance such that the societal responsibilities and support are recognised in respect of the individual contribution and support that one can expect. That might come across just as a jumble of words. What does it mean in practice? But I suppose that's part of my personal philosophy.
In grid between being social democrat and at the same time social conservative is maybe for many people a little bit strange. Yes. Although maybe in Central Europe it's
well, I don't.
Christian democracy is I think like accepted, but
so I think one of the things that I can explain, and I think I need to explain, is a little bit, so what is this label, Social Democratic Party, and to what extent does it have different meanings to different people? I'm here as a private individual. In fact, of course, as a guest of this podcast, I'm not representing the SDP officially. Of course, what I want to say and what I want to believe is consistent with it. But the story of the SDP very, very quickly is that it was born in the early 1980s as an offshoot, as you'll know, from the Labour Party then, the so-called Gang of Four, and a big declaration. They felt that the Labour Party in the 1980s in the UK was getting too left-wing radical, and that they felt that the big European-wide, actually, social democratic tradition, actually Christian democratic tradition as well, although the Gang of Four wouldn't necessarily have emphasised that. They felt that there needed to be a rebalancing. In the 1980s, there was a big upswing, and then eventually, effectively, the two-party system, two-party system, and the first past the post electoral system made it impossible for a new resurgent party to challenge a party to take over. It went down to a low ebb, but now under new leadership, William Clouston, it really is on the up. So I think it's no contradiction for a party to be socially conservative, believing in family, community, nation, but also as not in distinction to that, but as a corollary to that, to say that there are certain things that can't be left to a free market, for instance, to cite one example. the water infrastructure in the UK is completely broken. It was privatised with good intent, I think, and not incorrectly at the time, but now it is largely run for the benefit of large investors overseas, and you'd see a lack of care for customers in the United Kingdom. So I think for the sake of community, it needs to be nationalised and restructured, not necessarily. So it's just one example. Yeah. I don't see a contradiction between them.
Yes. Is it like there are some strategic sectors and economy, which is not really good if most of them are in private hands, and also there are social institutions like family and others which cannot be privatized, let's say, or should be defended.
Yes. So I think that's true, and I don't want to necessarily to go too deep into this, but I would say strategic sectors that need some intervention at the moment are the utilities sector, the energy sector, which is not serving well. The railways, for instance, there was good reason for privatising them, but the structure was wrong and was inevitably going to get worse. So things like that, and housing. Housing is a multi-generational failure in Britain, and the young people today have to think about so much more saving up for so many more years before they can afford a house. So that's another failure that does need, in my view, state intervention. But that doesn't make me statist, it doesn't make me socialist, it doesn't make the party socialist per se.
Yeah, of course. There are much. I think many of your position coincides with, for example, with the recent Hungarian government's positions in many issues, or I don't know, with the CDU, CSU government in Germany, so something like.
Yes.
It's not so strange in continental Europe, maybe.
No, and I think this is one of the really interesting ways in which Britain politically, socially maybe as well, but politically has been diverging from the European Union, ironically almost since the point of the Brexit vote.
Yeah.
That in general the trends within European Union countries within their national elections, we'll see what the European elections hold in the next week or two, but have been trending towards more small c conservative positions just at the time that in Britain mainstream conservatism, if you can call it that, is going through an absolute existential crisis, in fact, within the Conservative Party. And I think the reasons for that, the theme of today's conference seminar later on, symposium, is it feels as if it's about outward and external things quite a lot, the dynamics between countries and between nation states. My interest, of course, as someone appealing to voters in my area in West London, is what does it mean internally? And this is where I come to sense of community. What does it mean to be a member of a community which is part of a nation now? To put it really simply, is it effectively increasingly segregated groups, each called a community, vying for or against each other on a zero-sum game, some win, some lose, but losing sense of nationhood, particularly if affiliations really are contradictory, or actually an eye to countries of origin, which leads to a fracturing within the country. And I want to say that the STP, what I stand for, I come to New Culture Forum as well, is about creating new community, or a new sense of community which transcends all of these boundaries.
I was told that and also you spoke about now that the question of locality is very important for you.
Yes. No, I think so, very much. I think so. And just touching on this New Culture Forum participation, this organisation that I'm bringing to it. So, again, very briefly, New Culture Forum is a culturally conservative think tank, preeminent thinking about, let's call it traditional culture, Western civilization, Judeo-Christian based culture, particularly as it's been coming under threat manifestly in Britain as elsewhere. Again, what does it mean to be a citizen, a member of a community? And what I have been helping with is taking the New Culture Forum, like a Westminster bubble think tank, like all of the others, with a very, very good YouTube channel, lots of high quality programming, but turning it into a nationwide movement. And the way we've done it very, very quickly is to say, let's start Norwich as a city. We had someone in Norwich saying, I feel an affinity with New Culture Forum values, but I've got no idea whether anyone else in Norwich is common sense like me, share those values. So we created a group there, and now there's a flourishing group of people who get together. Psychologically important that they know they're not alone, they're not isolated. One of the tactics of the opposition often is to give a sense of isolation, so people just give up. They give up and go away. So we've created new hope by re-engaging people who are completely politically disenfranchised, have no representation from Westminster, have no sense in which people even care they exist, let alone want to listen to what they have to say. So we now have 26 such groups around the country. Our aim is 60, 70, 80, all localised, really important, different character to each group, but coming together into an overall movement. I'm really proud of that, and I want to say that it is a brand new, we don't see a pattern or a blueprint elsewhere, a brand new sense of political movement, not political party, but next to, adjacent to.
Is it like awakening and putting in the light an electorate which was hidden or silenced, something like this?
Yes, I think so. I think there's a lot of talk within small c conservatives about the vast numbers of people who have gone missing.
It does not vote.
They don't vote. They don't know who to vote for. A lot of them actually are ex-Labour voters. So Labour has obviously moved away from traditional, large swathes of their traditional base, working class families and so on. In particular, those who go back generations of Labour, they've given up on Labour. Conservatives thought they had captured them in the so-called Blue Wall election of 2019, but they've done nothing for them ever since. Nothing. In fact, they have just thrown sand into their faces, so to speak, which is why there is such utter bewilderment and actually increasing anger. I think one of the jobs of politicians, actually everywhere, and not just in Britain, but let's say particularly in Britain, is to make democratic politics still relevant and useful to people as a way of bringing about change, because when people give up on that, they will find other routes, and it is essential that we make sure that those routes aren't taken that could lead to violence or something.
I wanted to ask about the New Culture Forum, but you already answered my question, but I do have two last questions. One of them is that you seem to be very optimistic about overriding or to have a good results in the first past the post two-party system of Great Britain, which the political science holds that it's very hard to have a say from a third party in such a system as in Great Britain or in the US. So
yes, so I have come across as over-optimistic. No, I'm not. I think
there were the Liberal Democrats, of course.
Well, of course, the Liberal Democrats as well. We have to mention them, give them honourable mention in any such podcast about others. And of course, as you will know, there is the Reform Party, which has its roots in the old Brexit Party, which is vying, and it is doing well in the polls. It's got more of a national reach than the SDP has, for instance. One of the really big questions is about, does this feel like overly fragmented challenger parties? Shouldn't they come together? And that's not going to happen in time for this election. But what happens after the election? So one outcome could be, it doesn't feel like a positive outcome, but it feels like it could lead to something which is a shattering of the capital C Conservative vote, a decimation, not a decimation, a reduction to a small rump of Conservative MPs, and an opportunity to retake the right of centre space in some new way. Meanwhile, of course, that means that Labour has a very large majority. I don't think that would be good for the flourishing of this country. I really don't. So there is a period of pain that would ensue, but it may be a very necessary thing for rebuilding or building of something new. So the optimism is a long-term optimism. Yeah. I'm a very deep Scrutonite when it comes to a sense in which love of country, love of place, the ability to create a high-trust society as long as people generally adhere to an overall set of rules. That's community-wide rules. I think that's where the human spirit lies, and that's where the future will eventually be. It won't be, it cannot be, to my mind, a socialist progressive place, because I think that is anti-human in the end, and always ends up in oppression.
Scrutone's father was also an old school Labour voter back in time, so it's can be reconciliated the two positions.
Yes.
So you, what are your predictions for the election?
No. My only prediction is that whatever I predict will be wrong. I think there are still some very hard to understand dynamics. We've been concentrating on the right of centre situation. The left of centre, there are some unknowables. There is, of course, as is everyone can see day by day, there is an increasing sense of Muslim groups flexing their political muscle, putting pressure on Labour candidates or supporting independents. There's a rising party under a guy called George Galloway, which is tapping into that sort of disaffection. And that could lead to a bleeding away of Labour votes, and in quite large numbers of constituencies there's a strong enough presence of Muslims who are going to exercise their vote very carefully that could lose Labour lots of seats. So the sort of it isn't monolithic on the left, and I think that is going to have almost a bigger impact than the, as it were, positive, constructive arguments right of centre. So who knows how it will fall. There was one election, I can't remember, 2016, if I can get it right, where if somebody worked out, a psephologist, an electoral expert worked out that if 31,000 people in very specific places in the most marginal constituencies had voted differently, the result of the election would have been different. So it is the sort of tipping points and the dynamics are so hard to predict. So as I say, my own prediction is that I'm going to be wrong in what I predict.
And the last question is that both Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian Prime Minister, and the Politico, the Brussels-based news portal, let's say, leftist news portal, spoke and wrote about the phenomenon that the Muslim voters are so much now, although they are minority, but for example in France more or less 10% or something like this, that they will have their say in European politics. I mean, every country in Europe, especially in Western Europe, which means that they will be the swing party in the case of coalitions. So they will have a big saying, and we see it in France regarding the Gaza conflict, and that the more radical right-wing parties are reconciliating with the Jews, and the left-wing parties, which were the traditional part of the Jewish communities, are shifting their loyalties to the Muslim voters. So how you see this phenomenon in England or in Great Britain?
Well, so I think some of what you have said, I think very much holds. My part of West London, which is Ealing, has long been celebrated as the place with the greatest different number of ethnic groups of any local authority in the entire country. Many Poles came, for instance, and settled in the 1930s, and there have been waves and waves of various people ever since. My appeal to those who might vote for me is that when you exercise your vote, don't think about narrow groups. Think about the interest of the whole community. What are you doing for the whole community, whether they are affiliated to your worldview or not, because I think that's the only way there's going to be peace and prosperity in a country. And that is asking people to act against the advice often from community leaders who want to exercise their political muscle in a more partisan, dare I say, sectarian way. I just don't think that's good for any of our futures, including those members of the of Muslim communities. I don't think it's good for flourishing. So think twice before you vote. Don't go for narrow partisan interests. Think about everyone.
Thank you very much for your time. It was the Scrutone podcast.
Thank you very much.